Have you checked the children? You're a little mad sometimes.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Bienvenidos, Fright fans of the hottest entertainment on the planet. I'm Jaime and Fuego, and I am introducing this as kind of a dual sort of thing because I'm not sure if this is going to be the horror show or yours truly's program in Fuegotainment, and that's because I am forging forward with something completely new as far as my book coverage, which I've been doing for a number of years on the Horror Show channel, and namely with Hail to Stephen King, that is now in its 6th season of coverage, over 300 episodes, and yet I have also had a few diversions, including Run to the Hill, which was Joe Hill coverage, as you see right there in the center, and also Barker at the Moon, ha ha ha! Yes, so I have done Clyde Barker, Joe Hill, and Stephen King book coverage on the Horror Show channel, but we have kind of a strict programming regimen, so I'm not 100% if this is going to end up on Fuegotainment, my personal channel, which is in the midst of a July relaunch, or if this is going to be just a little bonus sort of episode on the Horror Show. But nonetheless, I needed to frame it as such because I just have to talk about what I just finished reading. That's right, going away from those big-time names, and for at least a well-respected name, despite the fact that he has not published a lot of work, and that is none other than Scott Smith's book, The Ruins. Yes, and so Scott Smith has only published 2 novels. There was A Simple Plan, which was adapted into a feature film that starred, Billy Bob Thornton and Bill Paxton, and then this, The Ruins, which came out a few years after the Simple Plan film, was also adapted into a 2008 movie, but this original novel came out in 2006, and apparently when Scott Smith was working on the screenplay for A Simple Plan was when he started putting this book together. And he said that he would start and stop, and he would get stuck, and, he kept hitting wall after wall, but then finally he caught a groove and he put this crazy mixture of social commentary, body horror, to just the frightening aspect of being lost in a nation other than the one that we live in here in the United States. And that's just not just for US people. I would imagine, if you're coming from somewhere in Europe or wherever, if you're in a sort of remote, desolate, jungly type area, which these 4, post-grad kids end up in, you would be in the midst of a rather frightening situation. And that is the premise of The Ruins, Scott Smith's second novel. And so you have 2 different couples. So you have Jeff and you have Amy, and then you have Eric, and you have Stacy. And then there are a couple other people that they just meet on this trip down to Cancun that are along for the ride as they decide to leave the very safe confines of their resort and decide to actually go and explore some of these Mayan ruins that are a few hours, kind of riding in some dilapidated taxi truck sort of situation to get to this area. And there is a little bit of a convoluted setup as to how we actually get there. So they make friends with this guy named Matthias, I think, if I'm pronouncing it properly. So he is a German tourist that was there with his brother Heinrich, and his brother Heinrich gets very suddenly involved with a girl who is part of an archaeological dig that is a few hours outside of said resort, as I mentioned. And so Matthias' brother just decides to run off with this girl after a hookup, and he leaves a map to these particular ruins where there is allegedly this excavation that's been going down that the girl that his brother ran off with was a part of. And so the 2008 feature film was really what held me back from actually reading this novel proper, because I loved A Simple Plan, both the book and the film, and yet I didn't like The Ruins so much as a movie, and ironically enough, Scott Smith also wrote the screenplay for that one too, so he was responsible for, writing the script for each of his novels as they were converted to, a visual sort of statement on screen. And so I appreciated some of the body horror aspects, but I felt like the storytelling, without getting too super spoilery, was a little bit silly as far as just what happens with some of the local wildlife without getting into too much detail, at least here initially. I will eventually have to spoil some stuff to give some adequate context to this, so I will give you a proper forewarning when that transpires. But really, the most interesting thing about Scott Smith's writing, even more so in this than in A Simple Plan, at least for me, was peering into the head of these characters and developing them in such a fascinating fashion. And that was the one thing that was really lacking in a lot of ways in the Cliff Notes that was the screen adaptation in 2008. And yet I felt like A Simple Plan, actually, since, it was also a small cast in that too, but I felt like we understood the motivation and the nature of those characters, especially the brotherly dynamic between, Paxton and Billy Bob's characters. I don't know, and Sam Raimi directed the hell out of that film. If you've never seen A Simple Plan, man, get on it, because it is tremendous, and the book is fantastic as well. But, this is one where the book is so just leaps and bounds beyond in its superiority to what we saw on screen. Now, that's not to say that upon a rewatch of the film, after finishing this, I didn't find some additional merits within, but that's because I enjoyed this book so goddamn much, and the way he gives it, like, our 4 leads, they are all, with the exception of Amy, who doesn't really get as much to do until the survival sort of situation that they find themselves in this jungly, sort of area. We start to figure her out a little bit more so later in the book, but at least initially it does feel like Stacy and Eric are our leads. Stacy specifically, who is kind of a drunk and kind of a flirt, and she is the most vulnerable and yet the most, I don't know, flawed in some ways, but then again, we start to realize the flaws of all of these characters, and that in some ways is what makes them so multidimensional, so grounded, so well-rounded in a lot of ways. We've got a few of them, most notably Jeff, who are pre-med, and so they're all on this trip because they've just graduated, and they're heading off either to graduate school, or in the case of Eric, he's going to go right into teaching. And so he's almost like a man boy, as from his internalization and, just like, thoughts and whatnot, his observations and just recollections of certain things. And this is where I can see why Sai King, my beloved author, had this to say to Entertainment Weekly about The Ruins. The book of the summer. No quietly building Ruth Rendell-style suspense here. Smith intends to scare the bejabbers out of you and succeeds. There are no chapters and no cutaways. The Ruins is your basic long scream of horror. It does for Mexican vacations what Jaws did for New England beaches. It works well enough, I think, to be the book most people will be talking about this summer. Enjoy the beach, enjoy the books, and watch out for those Mexican ruins. The interesting thing about this is there's not really, at least as far as what we saw in the movie, there's not really like ruins like we see in the movie. It's just eventually, this quartet, these 2 couples, and then the 2 other just kind of hangers-on, most notably Matthias, who, was searching for his brother, and that's how he had the map to get them to this spot in the first place. But then there was also a trio of these Greek brothers who were all going by like Mexican names, and I think Pablo, if I remember correctly, one of the 3 brothers actually goes along with our 2 couples and with the German, and then the other 2 brothers are supposed to be making their way afterwards and meeting up because they have a copy of the map that is left for them. But so, back to the internalization and the fact that these characters are so much more well-developed compared to the film because of the fact that we have all of those inner thoughts and, observations and stuff. And so Eric is the only one who seems a little lost. He's in a relationship with Spacey Stacy, as I mentioned, and she's making out with some dude, when he's not around, early in the book during a party night, and it's one of the it's one of the Greeks. And so, it lays the groundwork for her character, but yet in some flashbacks and in this recurring dream about her uncle that she has, and some very stark advice that he gave her about, just waking up one day and realizing that despite what you strived for your life to be, or at least thought that it should be, it doesn't always work out that way. And he had a terribly tragic accident that you find out in that same recollection that Stacy has. And so, Stacy and Eric get a lot of the initial focus, but then it's once we get to the predicament that happens when they find said ruins, but it's not even ruins, once again, like you see in the film. It's more so like an abandoned excavation site that they find with, like, tents and clothes and all that certain stuff after they walk through this little village once they finally get to this place. And all signs are pointing to why they should not go there. First and foremost, the path to actually get to this excavation site has been blocked off, and then even as they are trying to make their way there are some of the local villagers that, they are initially trying to talk to, and yet they don't even speak Spanish, obviously, and so Jeff does, the pre-med guy who kind of becomes the knowledgeable hero of sorts, the one who really takes charge along with the German once they find themselves in this trapped predicament that they find themselves in after they get to this excavation site. But it's really, there's like a little mine shaft that they go down that yields some answers and some clues and whatnot, but it's not like a like pyramid, like, you know, Mayan pyramid sort of thing like you see in the film. I guess, you know, they're like, hey, how can you have a title like The Ruins when, you know, there's no like big structure for us to, which was, you know, one of the big faults of the film. But I understand with, you know, the transference to the screen, how you had to have something like a little bigger and a little grander. But the book just really goes for the jugular in comparison with the nastiness. The film, the film, interestingly enough, there's a lot of the same beats, but yet some of the beats from the novel are like, they're kind of flip-flopped and they're handed off to different characters. Like certain bad things that befall one character in the book, for whatever reason, Scott Smith in the script decided to switch it over to happening to a different character, but yet we still hit a lot of the same, you know, plot points and stuff. So it's a little odd, but so yeah, all signs are pointing to them not going there, and yet once they get there, just the full scope of the horror really starts to present itself. And I think the book does start out rather slow, and you know, even though King says, you know, on the back, no quietly building, I disagree. I actually think that the book does quietly build, but it builds its characters, okay? And so once we're like 100 or so pages in, and you start to realize the full scale and scope of this horrible situation, this trap essentially that they are in, essentially, this area where this dig has been happening is quarantined by the local villagers around, and they will not let them go. You know, there's a few with firearms, most notably this Perlon, this bald dude that they tried to talk to initially when they were first getting to the village, and even the taxi dude who gives them the ride is like, no, you do not want to go there. You do not want to go there. And yet, yeah, they forge forward and very naively walk into a situation where it's just the naivety, like I just said. It's the fact that they didn't even plan how they were going to get back. They just assumed, oh, you know, the Greek brothers are friends in the movie, but it's you know, it's Pablo, I think, is if I remember correctly, what the Greek guy was at least calling himself. But yeah, they just naively assume, they're like, oh yeah, the other two brothers are, you know, friends as in the film are going to show up and everything's going to be just fine. And so that is where the blissful ignorance really just pervades as they are trapped in this area that obviously has some really bad shit that has gone down in it, and as they start to discover more things, most notably decomposed bodies and a few other bits, that's where it really starts to veer into where I could see some people thinking it's a little ludicrous, it's a little outrageous, and this is where I guess I will just say not first and foremost, but as a last bit before I start to veer into spoilers and really talking about what this book is really about and what it turns into with the body horror later on. I loved this book. I loved how bleak it became. I loved how vicious it was, and it does not. It's not puppy dogs and ice cream. That is for damn sure. It is very much. It will leave you with kind of a sick, sad sort of emptiness in a lot of ways for what befalls some of these characters. But now, as I veer into spoilers and just really talking about what we have transpire in the back half of this book that impressed me so much, is that, yeah, we have a sort of localized vegetation that is, not only is it acidic when you're like ripping leaves and stuff off of these particular vines and flowers and whatnot, but it has kind of a sentience about it. And so I guess you would say like an evolved Venus flytrap maybe to some ways, because yeah, it's also carnivorous. And so when you see all of these decomposed bodies, and you do in fact find Matthias' brother, and you find, you know, some other bodies that are pretty much not, unlike his, which was shot presumably after they were quarantined by the locals and then trying to escape. And so, yeah, this small Mayan village beside has tasked it with themselves to not let anybody potentially infected by what is in this area to leave. So if the plants don't get them, they will be killed as they, you know, kind of make their escape. And that's presumably what happens with the German's brother, and yet he is still, like parts of his body are missing. And then later on, especially as Jeff starts to investigate, and as, you know, the hours turn into days, and they're starting to worry about rationing food, and if they're going to have enough water, and they're waiting for rain to come, and even though it rained like practically every day when they're at the Cancun resort, there's like no rain initially, and so they're trying to figure out, you know, should we start pissing into a bottle, and then, you know, how can we distill it, and all this different stuff. So it does, as many have described it, it does turn into a survival horror sort of book, and yet it does become creature to a degree, and it does become body horror when you start to realize what these plants can do. And when you start to actually see it happen, as opposed to just seeing the aftermath of, these bodies that are down to just pretty much like bones, like everything, even like the leather from wallets and stuff, and, certain straps has been eaten away. Anything consumable by these carnivorous plants, these vines and flowers, fair game, obviously. And the worst is where they try to go down into the mine shaft because they think they hear this cell phone down there, and the Greek falls and breaks his back. And so there is this extensive, there's a lot of really cinematic moments that Scott Smith does a terrific job of basically describing and borderline scripting in this. The injury to Pablo and having to do a makeshift sort of, stretcher, mat sort of thing to raise him up and out of this mine shaft area. And then later on, when the plants are revealed to have crawled under his sleeping bag and eaten away at his legs, and it develops into so much more and more dire and horrifying of a situation, and it just gets scarier and more gruesome. Most notably, what happens with, after all of the trauma that, that Stacy and Eric had gone through, trying to, or maybe it was Amy and Eric. In any event, after the initial trauma of trying to get Pablo out of the mine shaft with his broken back, they're Amy and Stacy, who are best friends, and then Eric and Jeff, being the respective boyfriends, are just kind of, they're coexisting with each other, really, in a lot of ways. And so there's a scene where, after all of the trauma, Stacy decides to jerk Eric off with Amy right next to her in the tent. A little weird, right? Yeah, and that happens in the movie too, now that I think about it. But the thing that is not in the movie is the fact that as they are sleeping that night, the vines go into the plant, and because of the spoogie from Eric, they go in. Yeah, they go in. So anytime there is a secretion of bodily fluids, whether it's when I think Amy barfs at one particular point, and it's the plants are lapping up and eating the vomit, and then trying to go into open wounds, and then even with the spooge, so Eric is freaking out that these crazy parasitic plants are inside of him, and he starts to go crazy, and they cut him open at one point, and they're pulling pieces of the vine out, and it does really go for this disgusting body horror sort of stuff, and removing the Greek's legs at one point, so they're trying to save his life, and just what the plants proceed to do over and over, and just upping the ante with just their ferocity. It's so well done, and yet we still have those pauses to be reminded that these are very much human characters, like a game that Eric and Stacy play, where it's the so and but game. Yeah, it's where they're such and such happened, and they're but this and this happened, and then they're well, so this and this happened. So it's bits like that, and then also certain memories, most notably the one from Stacy and the advice her uncle gave her, but then Eric also remembering traumatic stuff that happened to other kids his age when he was growing up, some of those recollections, and even Jeff, with how analytical and methodical he is in taking charge of the situation, and pretty much seeming like he is going to be the one that is going to mobilize them enough to just hold out and wait for any sort of rescue, however unlikely it may seem, because even if the Greek brothers, do show up, are they going to be able to get past the just whole cavalry of, Mayan villagers that are guarding, the zone? Probably not. And they're it took us hours to even get here, because first they had to ride a bus, and then after the bus, they still had to take another taxi to get there. So they are out in the middle of nowhere in this area of Mexico. So they shift to being in denial very quickly. Most notably the girls. The two guys, Jeff especially, are very much realistic about the situation, and yet they're drinking despite the fact that there's very little water available, the stupidity of the characters, but yet you would kind of think that in such a terrifyingly traumatic sort of thing that you're facing, what else would you probably do than try to catch a buzz to get your mind off of it? I don't know. And even bits where they are discussing how they are going to make it out. Eric and Stacy and Amy, as they're finishing a bottle of tequila later in the book, they're yeah, they're going to turn this into a movie. They're going to put us on Time Magazine. We're going to have to mobilize and team up to make sure the movie rights are taken care of. And who would play you? And who would play you? And Eric's oh, I'll be the funny guy. Jeff will be the hero. And they're who's the villain going to be? And they're oh, the villain is going to be Matthias the German. They'll be he's got Nazi connections. And so, yeah, it's little just breakaways and, just little breathers, I guess, within the book that remind you about the humanity of these characters. And it's what makes it that much more tragic when some of them start to, you know, face their fate, so to speak. And it's gruesome, it's gross, and I loved it. This book was so awesome, and the ending is, especially, I can see why King gave it his thumbs up, not just because of the reminiscing flashback sort of stuff that he is very fond of, but also because of the fact that when a character, it's from their perspective as they're dying, and about, you know, the floods of pain, and then the approaching darkness and stuff, as these vines are, like, enveloping certain characters, and just, you know, that the flesh is being ripped off their bones and they are, you know, on the verge of death. Or also when other characters are shot by, you know, surrounding villagers and stuff. So there's a little bit of both the indigenous people and this weird indigenous wildlife that has almost evolved to such a degree, and they make hints that it was potentially found in that mine shaft, you know, that was part of this excavation process. But, so you don't really know. Was it something from deep inside the earth, almost like Phantom style? Dean Koontz, and I never mentioned Dean Koontz on Hail to Stephen King, but hey, I'll always mention that here. Or is it just a, you know, highly evolved Venus flytrap sort of situation where, you know, they will eat flesh and, you know, they can actually move a little bit and whatnot. I don't know, but it's really when you start to realize that they have that sentience that I mentioned earlier, and that they can mimic sounds and voices, most notably, which they really start to do in the third act, and it gets hella creepy. Yeah, I just dug the fuck out of this book, and ironically enough, you know, because I always like to read and listen, that's the thing that I do anytime I have this sort of book coverage going, and the audiobook is read by Patrick Wilson. Yeah, that Patrick Wilson. Conjuring, Insidious, lots of other stuff. And he's great. He does a hell of a job. He does the different voices, both male and female, very well. And yeah, just the precision of his enunciating and his cold delivery at times when it's absolutely necessary. Just tremendous, man. So at the end of the day, I highly, highly, highly recommend Scott Smith's The Ruins. I can't really recommend the feature film adaptation anywhere near as much. This is one of those situations where I thought A Simple Plan, his previous novel, and the film adaptation was like neck and neck as far as quality. That Sam Raimi film is exceptional. Whereas The Ruins, this novel is so much better in every possible capacity as far as just how grim, how nasty, everything. It's a terrific summer read, and here we are in the summer of 2022. Yeah, man, like almost 15 years since it was originally published. So, have you read The Ruins by Scott Smith? And if so, what did you think of it? And if you've seen the film, drop some of those comments below and give me your insight and yes, your thoughts. Greatly appreciated. So, I extend a grande gracias a Jaime and Fuego, and you can find more on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, here on YouTube. And once again, if you're watching this on Infuegotainment, obviously a like, a share, subscribe, all that stuff is fun. If you are watching this on the Horror Show channel, the same thing, but definitely, yeah, jump over. I'll have links to both channels regardless of where this actually pops up. And yes, I am actually currently in the midst of doing another Sai King recommended body horror-ish sort of thing. I'm about halfway through Nick Cutter's The Troop. And so that's going to be the next, I guess, diversion of sorts into the spooktacular literary world. So thanks again, a grande gracias, tanka arigato merci, for anybody who is checking out this video. I've been Fuego, y'all been Rad Status, and until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, hasta luego, sen amigos, constant readers, viewers alike, say thank you. I hope we've been well met, and we share more of this book palaver sooner rather than later. And until then, remember to stay scad, and obviously, read. Yeah, Scott Smith's The Ruins, and I look forward to hearing all of your insights on this.